You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Thor,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Brad Parks.
Flesh, Blood, Steel, the new book from David Alan Jones. 16-year-old Jake Harris wakes up after a horrific car accident to find 13 years have come and gone. He's 29 years old, a cyborg, and one of the world's most feared assassins. Horrified by the things he's done, things he can't remember, Jake vows never to kill again. Unfortunately, the company that owns Jake has other plans. They're not about to lose their top hitman to the errant memories of his teenage self. When Jake manages to escape them, they launch a worldwide manhunt that ranges from a near-future New York City to Paris. Desperate to remain himself, Jake joins a rebel faction dedicated to wresting control of the world's governments from the hands of militarized corporations. Using his enhanced body and perceptions, he is able to aid them in their fight. But Jake doesn't realize the rebels have their own plans for him, ones that involve unleashing his unique talents on their enemies. Faced with a dark past he can't recall and uncertain whom he should trust, Jake must come to terms with the sinister choices that molded him into the man he became. Question is, can he avoid doing it all again? Assassins aren't born, they're programmed. Flesh, Blood, Steel by David Alan Jones. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I am really excited to have Brad Parks back on the show with us. He was on the show last year at episode 336, talking about his new book, the award-winning Closer Than You Know, and I'm excited to have him back talking about his new book, The Last Act, which is on sale today when you're hearing this. Welcome back to the show, Brad.
Hank, it's good to be back. I'm actually surprised after the mess I made out of episode 336 that you're going to have me back on. But I'm glad that somehow I've managed to overcome. I guess after a year, the stink has kind of faded a little bit, and we can try this again.
You know, I don't remember it that way at all. I remember us having a fantastic time. But you know, everybody's experience.
No, you were great. I was a mess. Always.
Well, you know, your mileage may vary. So, so how's it been going this past year? You had a tremendous year, with your book. Last time it won some awards, got a lot of attention. How's the year been going?
It's been a great year. It's been a wonderful year. And I've been coming out with this next book, The Last Act, which I know we're going to talk about. And then, of course, always writing the next book. That's one of the funny things about authors who, the publisher likes to get the book a year ahead of time. So, the book we're actually promoting at the moment is actually the book we wrote a year ago, and the book most on our brain is the book we've just turned in. And it's a confusing mess, but I make my living as an author, and I love that, as you know.
Oh, yeah.
So I have no complaints, for sure.
Well, just to recap everybody real quick, you began your career as a sports journalist and transitioned over to news. What was the big story that really got your fiction writer brain turned on to start exploring stories of your own?
Right. So it was actually, I'd been a sports writer all throughout my teens and 20s, which, your teens and 20s is a great time to be a sports writer. But then eventually when you look around and you say, okay, I'm spending 120 nights a year in a Marriott. How is that going to work with family life exactly? And of course, the answer is it's not going to work well at all. And so I transitioned to news side, and my very first assignment was a quadruple homicide. 4 people shot in the back of the head, left for dead in a vacant lot in Newark, New Jersey. And unlike all of the sporting events I had covered, sports from a storytelling standpoint, Hank, is like the most wonderful thing ever, because every time you go to the ballpark, you get a beginning, middle, and an end. You get this full, beautiful story arc. You get to talk to the hero. You get to talk to the GOAT. You get the post-game stats. You get everything. But here's this homicide where, I guess we dimly know the beginning, but like we don't even know who these people are. We don't know why they've been killed, and we certainly don't know who done it. And so from a storytelling standpoint, it was deeply dissatisfying because we didn't get any of the answers. And by the way, this was not like an episode of CSI where they neatly wrapped it up in an hour either. As days went by and as weeks went by, this remained a real life mystery. And so that was kind of really dissatisfying to me. So one day I sat down and started with that beginning, 4 people shot in the back of the head, left for dead, and then started inventing everything else. And I really found, I wasn't sure about fiction before I started doing it, but I found there are things that are every bit as enjoyable about fiction versus real life, and in some ways even more enjoyable about fiction. Because you know what, Hank? Unlike journalism, where I have to sit around and wait for somebody's phone call, I don't have to wait for somebody's phone call to write a fictional story. It's just, kind of whatever I can dream up. So that it has been it's been going for 10 years now, and I'm having a great time with it for sure.
Well, being a sports writer has to be one of those things where like everybody loves the sports writer. You're reporting on games, and this is things that we all love, and we love to love certain teams, we love to hate certain teams, but it's all in good fun at the end of the day. When you start looking at stories of people being shot in the back of the head and then start dreaming up these stories of things like that, do you ever wonder, like, wow, what was this suppressed thing that I've been carrying around for so long that now this twisted side of me starts coming out?
Right. The dark corner of my soul.
Right.
I call it my creepy attic. And I think maybe we all have it, but I've just got this fascination with things dark and dreary. And I think, so what I call it the creepy attic is every now and then I reach up, and by the way, it's not a walk up attic. You gotta pull down the stairs, and the springs in the stairs make that noise, and then you climb up there and it's all dusty and spiderwebby, and you pull the chain to bring the light on. And then you quickly grab something and run down the stairs again because it's so darn scary up there. But I definitely have that, and I don't know. I have always found crime to be an incredible platform from which to examine the human condition. I always said that as a newspaper reporter, if I was interviewing you, chances were very good that it was the worst day of your life.
Right.
And the worst day of your life is a really extraordinary spot to start with from fiction. And so I think in fiction, I really do try to take people on the worst days of their life. And then you see, okay, how do they get through it? How do they handle it? And I'm kind of forever fascinated to see how that turns out with every new character.
Well, that's a really unique way to look at it. I think people really, when we talk about horror writers or crime writers or people that write stories about the darker side of humanity, the assumption is that these writers are broken inside, and these are stories coming from, their brokenness. And it's exactly the opposite. Some people that write some of the darkest stuff are just the sweetest people in the world. But I've never really thought about it that we're telling stories, about the human condition, but we're talking about these are the darkest days of someone's life, and we're looking at how humanity then deals with that. So it's like we're dealing with dark stories, but we're trying to shine a light on those in some way.
Right. And I think, also, what crime fiction really does is it allows us to approach those dark things from just a little bit of a safe distance. And I think there is something about humanity. I mean, when you get right down to it, Hank, we have actually gotten too good at being human beings. And so many of the tumults and difficulties that used to define humanity's life, as human beings, we have basically eradicated famine. like famine, this enormous scourge that killed millions of people throughout our history and was never very far away. Like a famine was for most of human history only a bad weather season away from being a reality. And yet we have somehow completely eliminated famine. We have also basically eliminated, getting eaten by lions, or, think of all the diseases that we have beaten into basically submission. Like our lives are almost too easy, and yet we are evolved to have that danger, to have that sense of like the famine is coming or the lion is coming. And I think crime fiction taps into that. It gets us close to and kind of turns those juices on that we are evolved to have. So, so yes, Hank, I think I'm not just writing silly little stories to entertain people. I am helping them navigate their lives and understand their lives and really fulfilling them in ways they really didn't even know they needed to be fulfilled.
Right. Well, in writing crime fiction or thrillers, and your books kind of span those genres. Sometimes we're like your last book, Closer Than You Know. That was a story of a family that was having the worst thing that we could imagine as parents happen, and we got to, live through, walk in some other people's shoes, live through some horrible things that God forbid, we never have to deal with. Your new book, The Last Act, takes something that we all lived through collectively and read in the news and I think ultimately saw some fallout for the greater society at large in the coming years after the story. What was the motivation to tackle this particular piece of news?
Yeah, so the genesis of The Last Act, and basically to set it up for readers or for listeners who might not be familiar with it, you have it tells the story of Tommy Jump, who is an out-of-work actor who is hired by the FBI to play what I call the role of a lifetime. He has to go to federal prison, befriend an inmate there, a disgraced banker by the name of Mitchell Dupree, who has some documents that are relating to money laundering. Because on the outside, that's what got Mitchell sent to prison. He was laundering money, but he has kept these documents, and if these documents get into the hands of the FBI can use them to basically bring down this ruthless Mexican drug cartel. The real life inspiration is what happened with Wachovia Bank. And actually, Hank, it's a funny thing. I was actually a customer of Wachovia Bank while the following was occurring. Yes, thank you for that. Basically, Wachovia had this program where they had a relationship with currency exchange houses in Mexico, where anybody could take a wrinkled bag of pesos, walk into a currency exchange house, have it turned into American dollars, and then sent to an account at Wachovia for a small fee, mind you. And this was basically kind of an open invitation to the cartels to launder money, and unsurprisingly, several cartels took them up on this offer. This went on for about 4 years, during which time $378 billion went back and forth between Mexico and America. Yeah, more than a third of $1 trillion. And the thing is, Wachovia could not tell you who was on the Mexican end of that. So it was in violation of one of the most basic laws of banking, which is you have to know your customer. So sure enough, the Sinaloa cartel actually very much welcomed themselves to this opportunity, which about 4 years later, the DEA finally figured it out because Mexican authorities had seized an airplane, a DC-9 airplane. I don't know if you've ever flown in a DC-9, but we're talking about a major commercial airliner here. And so it had $100 million worth of cocaine. So Hank, I don't mean to be getting political, but build all the walls you want to, and the cartel is going to laugh at them as they fly over it in their airplane, right? And so basically the DEA kind of said, okay, how did they afford this airplane? And it turned out they afforded the airplane the same way I was buying my breakfast cereal at the time, which is out of an account with Wachovia. Because the cartel had moved all of this money into a perfectly legitimate account at Wachovia that any airline broker was happy to take money from. So that was kind of the genesis for that. Now, where I have to twist things fictionally is I sent my banker to jail right? Because, readers have a very good sense of justice. You cannot get them all wound up about money laundering, and then they ask the question, well, what happened to the evil banker? And you say, oh, nothing. He got away. He paid a fine and then he moved on. But that, in reality, is what happened in the real Wachovia case. The bankers paid a fine and moved on. Nobody went to jail.
Which is insane. And yeah. our sense of justice is, I'm amazed there's not rioting in the streets. We want the sense of justice in our fiction, yet for some crazy reason, we're not outraged about this.
Oh, I think we are outraged. The unfortunate thing is we feel like we can't do anything about it.
Right. Right.
And that, I think that's, a lot of people in America today have outrage over a number of very salient issues that they feel like they can't do anything about. But that gets us into a political discussion that probably neither you nor I want to have today.
We've got good stuff to talk about. We've got exciting stuff to talk about. So the premise that I love about this book, is that you use an out of work actor to go undercover, which I thought was just brilliant, because who better to take on the role better than an out of work actor. Where did you come up with that idea?
Oh, who knows where these ideas come from, Hank? I really enjoyed the idea too. It's one of those. I always say I get about 10 ideas for books a week, Hank.
Yeah.
And 10 and a half of them are bad.
Right.
But every once in a while you get an idea that you go, oh, that one's pretty good. And the way you know it's pretty good is because you keep going back to it and you don't forget it. Like, so most of the 10 ideas I forget within days of when I've had them, and they go away. But like that premise, the out of work actor hired by the FBI, I just liked. And so I probably thought of that in, 2014, 2015, and kind of stuck it on the back burner. And when it was time to write my 2019 book, it was like, okay, I'm ready to write that one. Let's see where that one takes us. And of course, I never know until I start.
Right. Well, and that brings us to a good point. You told us last time that you are a pantser, and
I'm a total pantser. Yes.
That's one of those discussions that gets people very animated. When you start talking about pantsers versus plotters. People say, well, if you're just flying by the seat of your pants, you'll never finish a book, or your revisions are going to be horrible. You're going to rewrite the book because you don't know what's going on until the end. But you keep up a pretty diligent schedule, and you can turn out a first draft in about 3 months or so, don't you?
Yeah, 3-4 months, something like that. And yes, you're right. The revisions are horrible, and it really truly is a daunting thing to do. But I've learned for me, and I think this is the most important thing for any writer: find what works for you and stick with it, right? And for me, that fear and that sense of desperation that I don't know how this thing is going to go gives real energy to the writing. And I sit down every day to the computer really not necessarily knowing what's going to happen. I mean, now most days, I don't want to overstate this, Hank. Typically I will start the day knowing, okay, I think I need to write this scene. But if that scene ends up taking a twist that I didn't see coming, I can kind of follow it wherever I'd like to, which is what I really did. I always say that, especially after, this is the last act is my 9th book. And by this point, I've kind of learned that books are like children in a lot of ways. But one of the ways in which they're like children is that they really take on their own personality, kind of irrespective of the creator. I'm often surprised by how little input I have into my books and what form they shape, just like the way I have very little input into what form my children take. But this was, as this book's personality came out, like this really became the book that surprised me more than any other book I have probably written. And because, at every time I would come to a major decision point, what would end up coming out was something different than what I thought it would be. And so it was just a case of, all right, now I have to follow that twist. All right, now I have to follow that twist. Now I have to follow that twist. And it got me into a spot that was, don't get me wrong, at times really difficult, because I had these characters, really in a place where it's like, all right, genius, how are you going to get them out of that? But it was a lot of fun and terrifying at the same time to sort of follow everything to its logical conclusion. And I don't want to give anything away, obviously, but it led me to a place that absolutely surprised me, and so hopefully it will surprise the reader as well.
Absolutely. One thing that helps when you sit down to write is to know your material, to know something about what you're writing into. So when you've got these two real story elements to begin with, you've got international banking and you've got prison. How do you prepare yourself to write about these things when your background is journalism, not necessarily felony indictments? Or do you? I don't know.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Are you a process server, Hank? Should I be worried? I think the beautiful thing about journalism, of course, is it teaches you how to ask questions and how to continue to ask follow-up questions. And it teaches you to learn about something you knew nothing about and do it very quickly. One of my favorite cartoons shows a journalist with a dart throwing it at a dartboard, and the dartboard says, "Today I'm an expert at," and then you have to instantly become an expert in something. So, in the case of the prison, I set the book at the Federal Corrections Institute in Morgantown, West Virginia, which is a real place that I really did visit. It's kind of a fascinating place to go. It is, first of all, it's minimum security. So as you walk up to it, the first thing you notice is there are no walls. There's actually the most forbidding barrier you face as you approach FBI Morgantown is this little split log fence leading to the joke.
Not even chain link.
Yeah. It was split log, leading to the joke that I put in the book that it looks like they had put Abraham Lincoln in charge of security. And the entire rear side of the prison is actually just this big hill, right? And yeah, you want to run? Go ahead. But if you run, you will not be going back to the minimum security prison. You will be going back to the medium or maximum security prison, which is like going back 10,000 years in evolution. Because, unlike at medium and maximum security facilities, you have all of the prison tropes about gangs and about racial violence and about assaults and all that kind of stuff that doesn't really exist at the minimum security facility. Like at FCI Morgantown, black guys have dinner with brown guys who have dinner with white guys who, and nobody's really going to shiv somebody because they're all nonviolent prisoners. They're all there for 10 years or less, by the way. So, their release date is not some completely foreign concept. It's something that they can sort of at least grasp might happen if they can keep themselves well behaved. But that for me was kind of a very conscious storytelling choice here, because I didn't want this book to be about the brutality of prison. Because I had visited other prisons, I had seen that brutality, and I really wanted this book to be about this kind of cat and mouse game between this actor and this banker and these documents. And I'm really relying on the cartel to provide the sense of danger. And don't worry, it does very quickly.
What does your character, Tommy Jump, the actor, how interesting was he to write for you, as the kind of the innocent guy in this who's being, and he's being paid, obviously, but being thrust into something that he really didn't know what he was getting himself into? What was it like writing that character?
Yeah, I guess I've always found I connect better with characters who are probably atypical of thrillers. So if the typical thriller character is the ex-special forces guy who can break your jaw by looking at it, that's just not a human being that I have a lot of in common with, frankly. Versus Tommy Jump is kind of an ordinary, everyday guy who's thrust into this extraordinary situation. And, I think the other thing about Tommy that was really poignant for me as an artist, if we can call authors artists, I mean, we're really craftspeople, but let's call us an artist for a second, is, he is this struggling artist. He is, so I made him he's a former child Broadway star who is now 27 years old. So he's too old to play the kid roles he used to play. But by the way, he's 5'4", so he's too short to be the leading man. But he's also still too young to play most of the character roles that eventually he might be able to be cast for. So he doesn't really have a space in the theater right now, and yet he still loves acting. He still has this dream. And I think for anybody who does a creative career, you know, whether it's being an artist or being an author or whatever, you know, and you have this dream, and it can be a very difficult thing to realize, and yet you cling to it, right? And maybe you're clinging to it out of a sense of desperation, or you're clinging to it out of a sense of love, or whatever. But that, you know, I mean, I think for a lot of authors, that's, and myself very much included, that's a real thing. You know, like I've had the good fortune to win some awards in my life, and Tommy Jump, the protagonist, he was once nominated for a Tony Award. You know, but at some point in the book, he says to his mother, he says, "Mom, do you know how many Tony Award winners there are who are out of work right now?" And the same thing is true for writers. I mean, I can't count the number of times that the person who wins the award, you know, 2 years later is out of contract because their books didn't sell. So there's that sense of being close to the bone, and there's that sense of really striving to continue to fill the dream that Tommy has. And I think that was really how I personally started being able to inhabit that character and really become that character in this fictional work.
Well, like you said, chapter 1 of every new book is kind of that great equalizer. Everybody's on the same footing again. No matter what your last book did, you know, you've got to do it again. And how do you deal with those feelings of inadequacy that come with every new project? Every writer goes through it. I've talked to, you know, people that have sold millions and millions of copies, and they say that, you know, every time they have to deal with this imposter syndrome. You know, we all have to do it all over again. How do you get that motivation to get it going again?
Well, so, I mean, first of all, yes, every writer, I think, deals, like, I'm actually deeply suspicious of somebody who says that they're such a great writer that they never have doubt. It's like, what's wrong with you, dude? You know, and by the way, probably the person who's saying that is not a very good writer. But, you know, it's just this balancing act of, like, and don't get me wrong, Hank, like, self-loathing like that is a huge part of my process, right? Because, like, yeah, I suck at this. How are they not going to see that I'm a complete fraud and whatever? But, like, it's like okay, a good mystery thriller, at certain points, you are deceiving your audience, and to write them, you have to deceive yourself. Basically, you have to put all of that natural self-doubt aside, and you say to yourself, all right, I am telling this story that people want to hear, and I am the person to be telling it, and I am telling it in the right way. And, like, I have to approach the keyboard with that sense of confidence every single day. And it can be a real active illusion at times, but yeah, it's and how do you do it? I mean, who knows, right? you bumble through it day by day, and somehow 4 months later you have a novel. But it's not easy. It's never easy. And I did an interview recently where somebody asked me, well, you know, and by the way, this was not a writer who was doing the interview. He says, you've won so many awards and so many. This must be getting easy for you by now. And, you know, I just laughed out loud, like, yeah, buddy, you clearly don't do this for a living, because it never, ever gets easy. But, you know, I guess I've learned to love the struggle and to embrace the struggle. You know, my wife is a school psychologist, and so we talk a lot about grit. Which is, you know, one of the real buzzwords in educational circles these days, which is, you know, they're figuring out that the kids who really succeed in school are, you know, it tends to be the rich kids, but it's not always rich kids, and it tends to be the smart kids, but it's not always smart kids. With like the one element that you can say this kid will succeed is the kid who is willing to bang her head against a problem time and time again until she finally gets it right. And I think that's true for authors too. You know, like, there's no stopwatch on this thing. I get to just keep going at it until something that sounds remotely readable comes out.
I love that. And grit is definitely that X factor when it comes to people that make it or don't. Brad, we're about to run out of time, but before we go, tell us about your favorite writing spot. My favorite writing spot is the corner table at a Hardee's restaurant.
which basically has everything that I personally need as a writer. It is about 5 miles away from home, so I can't hear my children screaming. It does not have wireless internet, so I do not have the distraction of things like podcasts and shark videos. Shark videos are a big thing for me.
Sure.
And then finally,
As it should be.
free refills on Coke Zero. Which is the fuel that makes most of my books actually happen, the caffeine from the Coke Zero. So, I spend about 4 hours a day there. I consider the workers at Hardee's to be my colleagues. And the beautiful thing about that from a writing standpoint is the Hardee's biscuit maker, who, by the way, gets there at about 4 o'clock in the morning to start hand making biscuits. She never says, I don't feel like making biscuits today. I'm not inspired to make the biscuits today. No, she makes the damn biscuits. And that's very much how I treat myself as a writer.
I love it. The new book, The Last Act, is available everywhere. Now, Brad, we're going to send everybody to pick up their copy of it. Tell everybody where they can find out more about you online, read all about your back catalog, connect with you, and all that good stuff.
Yeah, happy to do so, and thank you, Hank. It's on Facebook. I'm Brad Parks Books, so you go to www.facebook.com/BradParksBooks. On Twitter, I am Brad_Parks. And by the way, if you follow the hashtag #TheLastActQuotes, I've been pulling fun quotes from the novel The Last Act, so you can go and kind of read some of the greatest hits of The Last Act. And then there's always my website, www.bradparksbooks.com, where if you click on the contact form and find my email address, you can just send me an email saying hello and telling me that you either liked my book or didn't like my book. Either way, I'll write back to you.
Fantastic. Brad, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, buddy. I love the new book. We're going to send everybody to see you.
Awesome. Hank, thanks very much for having me on.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
I was 10 years old when I saw my first ghost. The year was 1770. My father was a barber. He kept a small shop at the Couenhoven Inn, where the King's Road met the Old Loop. Our modest home lay to the north, between the inn and the hanging tree. A simple box of pine boards whitewashed with crushed oyster shell, one room with a spinning wheel for mother, a chair for father, and up a ladder of branches, a garret where my parents slept. I slept on the floor below, alongside my little brother, Hans, 5 years younger than I. Our floor sloped toward the Hudson, so that when Hans rolled over in his sleep, he often went on rolling and couldn't stop, collecting splinters and grievances. Yet on this particular night, he slept peacefully, and I was the fitful one. A mouse had taken shelter in our wall, fleeing the October chill. It scritched and scratched, nibbling a nest for itself. The sound thrilled me. I possessed a vivid mind, full of toadstools and bullfrogs and lightning storms, and so imagined a skeleton writhed in the wood. The bones of Anne Underhill, perhaps, murdered by Indians at Spook Rock. I'd heard that tale from my father, who reveled in the Dutch superstitions. He would gather us to fireside on winter nights and spin tales of the Heer of Dunderberg, that storm king who rattled our white windows, of the Lady of Raven Rock, who died in snowfall, pining for her lover, of trolls beneath the Penny Bridge and hobgoblins in the hanging tree. He'd filled my head with such dark romance that I lay waiting for Anne's little finger bones to drag me off to some bloody fate. I rather hoped she would. A cloud cleared the moon, and a square of light fell on my mother's spinning wheel. The sharp spindle glinted, and the wheel began to turn, without touch. A figure appeared before me, as through a mist. A gray head bent to the work. She fixed me with eyes black as open graves and whispered in a low, guttural hiss, "Spin, or you shall not eat." I cried out and fell to my pallet, arms over my head. Hans awoke, lost his balance, and rolled away, bleating with pain as he struck the riverside wall. Father emerged above. "Agatha, what is wrong?" "There's a ghost, Papa. A ghost! Help me!" Hans laughed despite his bruises, and Mother moaned and ordered us to sleep. But Papa descended and took my hands, his blue eyes twinkling. "What did you see?" "An old woman. She said, 'Spin or you shall not eat.'" "Oh!" He raised a candle beneath his chin. "You saw old Willow. She lived here long ago, when this was the home of Isaac Hart, our candle maker. Her husband was killed by savages. Hart took her in at the request of Lord Phillips, who paid a token sum for her upkeep. But Hart was greedy and kept the money for himself. He never fed her unless she spun. So Willow spun and spun and spun, like a spider, year by year, growing old and blind and falling to waste. She died at that spinning wheel, fell over one day, and the spindle pierced her heart." Hans screamed and hid beneath the table. Mother appeared above. "Daniel Van Ripper, you are a fool!" I kissed Papa's fingers, for I loathed that spinning wheel. I'd be no toothless ghost, spinning and haunting little girls. I felt pity for such a spirit, and gratitude to have her example before me, steeling my resolve. Every night thereafter, I would leave a crust of bread for old Willow, and sleep with one eye open, in case she came to spin for me again.